Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. We are once again talking about developing situations in Latin America. We're going to lead off with the essentially the Cuba-style embargo of Venezuela, a full economic embargo launched by the Trump administration. And then we're going to get into some more kind of hemispheric, geopolitical issues and social issues a little later in the segment. Joining us once again, we're actually joined from Caracas by Ben Norton, who's an editor with The Grayzone, as well as the producer of Moderate Rebels podcast with Max Blumenthal. Thank you very much, Ben, for coming back on.
Of course, thanks for having me, and especially thanks for paying attention to these crucial issues here where the U.S. government is playing a key role in oppressing so many countries here in Latin America and so many millions of people. And unfortunately, not just the corporate media, but even much of progressive alternative media is not really interested in what's going on.
Yeah, it's been a little bit since I've covered Venezuela, because the kind of high profile things that generally make it into the news with regard to, especially the kind of coup attempt and the kind of regime change attempts over the past couple years. Those are very good for kind of headlines or whatnot. But the truth is that, Venezuela and the kind of struggle to resist U.S. imperialism remains as important as ever. And there have been some, it almost felt like Trump had forgotten Venezuela for a little bit. At least that's the kind of story that was coming out of the media, where like Trump's goldfish brain had forgotten he was supposed to overthrow Venezuela. But it seems that the U.S. embargo 2 weeks ago, we're recording this on August 20th. So yeah, the U.S. economic embargo a couple weeks ago would kind of reveal that not to be the case. So I'm wondering if you can just, being on the ground in Caracas right now, if you can give us kind of the rundown of how sanctions and how this new economic blockade have generally affected the country, both in terms of access to food, access to medicine, and also in terms of like how that sort of affects the morale as well.
Absolutely. There's a lot to say. First of all, I'll say I've been here for the past month, since July, and I'll be here for a few more months. I was also here in Caracas in February and March. So this year, I'll have spent about half the year here in Venezuela reporting, trying to figure out what's going on the ground, how people are resisting. And I will say that being here, I'm always so struck by just how surreal and blatantly fake American, and by me American, I mean U.S. corporate media reports are on Venezuela, also European corporate media reporting. I mean, it really is like another country. And you really see firsthand why people here do not trust the media at all in any way. And I should say it's not even just the gringo English language media, if you will. It's also much of the Spanish language media based in Miami, but also based in the region. So foreign right-wing media outlets that dominate the region here, like in Chile and Argentina, the propaganda in Venezuela is just overwhelming. I will say here right now, life is pretty normal. And most important of all, there's peace, which cannot be said for U.S. client states right now, like Honduras, which is going through a lot of violence. And hopefully we'll talk about that later, because I was in Honduras in March, and in May and June before coming here. And the situation is very different there, where there's a lot of violence. Here, there is no violence. People have finally found peace after 2017 had a series of months of extremely violent protests and coup attempts by the right-wing opposition backed by the U.S. Here, the coup attempts have completely fizzled out. The opposition has very little support aside from the eastern neighborhoods of Caracas, which are dominated by rich people who have bank accounts in the US and pay for everything in US dollars. And we can talk about, that 15, 20% of the population of, the capitalists who still are rich and are still living comfortably here in Venezuela. This is still very much a class society. The Bolivarian Revolution waged by the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which is the governing party that has won 23 of the past 25 elections, it has always remained a steadfastly democratic party working within the confines of this, capitalist democracy and trying to revolutionize the system from within a democratic framework, which has really limited many of the things they've been able to do. But they've always erred on the side of being extremely democratic, which is why it's so crazy, so just overwhelmingly ridiculous to hear people say that this is a dictatorship. In fact, despite the many problems, it still is much more democratic than my home country, the United States, which is frankly an extremely authoritarian country, which has 25% of the world's prisoners and 5% of its population, which has police everywhere, hyper-militarized police, where the two ostensible democratic parties, the Republicans and Democrats, are not democratic in any meaningful sense of the term. So despite the problems that exist here, it still is very much a democratic society. There still is an opposition that has been defeated, but it is not all in jail. They're not all political prisoners. I mean, they're still active, even though they have very little support. And most importantly, you were talking about the coup attempt. I first came here to Venezuela earlier this year in February, which was right in the middle of the U.S. government's coup attempt here. The U.S. government handpicked a right-wing young opposition leader named Juan Guaidó, and worked with him, collaborated for weeks and months beforehand, we know. Figures like Marco Rubio were on the phone with him. Mike Pence was on the phone with him, telling him to declare himself interim president, which he did on January 23rd of this year. And then when the coup initiated, there were several violent coup attempts by defectors from the military to overthrow the government. They all failed completely miserably. In fact, the most hilarious one was the day before May Day, the day before International Workers' Day, where around 25, a grand total of 25 soldiers defected and tried to take over a military base and completely failed. So this is the situation we're in now. And the only real remaining serious problem, which is a problem largely caused by the U.S., is the economy. Like I said, this is still a very functioning democratic society. There's peace. There's not violence. People are living normal lives. They're going to work. They're going to school. But the main problem is the economy, which is being strangulated by an illegal unilateral U.S. blockade, which is very similar to the U.S. blockade that has been imposed on Cuba now since 1960. So the clear economic strategy, the clear political strategy by the U.S. government, because every other strategy it has pursued has failed, is now economic suffocation. And as you mentioned, 2 weeks ago, in early August, the Donald Trump administration declared a total economic embargo of Venezuela. The only goal of that is regime change and collective punishment of the entire population. It has nothing to do with humanitarianism. It is effectively tightening what Ben Rhodes, the former Obama administration official, called tightening the noose around the neck of the Venezuelan people. By the way, when Rhodes said that, he was not opposing it. This is a bipartisan policy. The strategy began under the Obama administration and has reached its pinnacle, its logical conclusion under the Trump administration, which has simply taken every policy of strangulation implemented by Obama and push it to the maximum level, full throttle. And we can talk about what the economic effects are. But again, we need to stress that the U.S. coup has completely failed, and it failed because the opposition has been utterly defeated and is extremely unpopular here in the streets of Venezuela.
Yeah, there are so many threads there I'd love to follow. I think that was a very good overview of the situation generally. I think it's important to understand the nature of the opposition, first of all, that the so-called Venezuelan opposition, this is a far right-wing opposition that essentially, if I remember correctly, Juan Guaido's his kind of economic promise, his only real platform as he declared himself president, was essentially to roll back the major social democratic initiatives of the PSUV, such as the public housing. The PSUV has provided something like 2.5 million new public, essentially free housing for its own citizens, for its own population over the past few years or so. And also to essentially bring in, I believe Juan Guaido promised to bring in essentially loans from the International Monetary Fund at some point, which anyone who knows anything about IMF loans understands that that's essentially like his goal. Juan Guaido's vision for Venezuelan society is economic strangulation, is absolute economic ruin, and to become a U.S. Client state. Of course, at this point, Juan Guaido is so far discredited. He's so far even out of the picture. I also remember, as far as a kind of not hilarious, but in certain ways hilarious stunts, is when he liberated, quote unquote, I believe it was Leopoldo Lopez from his incarceration. And you would think, in the kind of authoritarian police state that we keep hearing that Venezuela is, you would think that Leopoldo Lopez, this great quote unquote freedom fighter, which again, I'm being sarcastic because Leopoldo Lopez is an actual fascist. You would think that he would be placed in some maximum security prison, but no, Juan Guaido and like a handful of people went and live streamed themselves liberating Lopez as like a couple guards stood by outside Lopez's own house. He was under house arrest. So that, everything they've done obviously undercuts the narrative that Venezuela is a quote unquote authoritarian police state or whatever that sort of thing is. I guess another comment I'd just like to add on is that, as you said, like I always love beating up on both the Republican and Democratic parties and showing how it is a completely bipartisan agenda, that so much of the so-called resistance to Trump has a near 100% alignment with Trump's foreign policy, and that includes many of the quote unquote Democratic socialists and the more quote unquote progressive wing of the Democratic Party as well has kind of failed to make a meaningful even ideological or rhetorical intervention there. And I guess the last point I'd like to hit on before we get into the effects of the economic sanctions is that there are so many structures within Venezuelan society that are truly democratic institutions for which we don't even have an analogy. We don't even have an analogous structure here in the United States. The U.S. has never had, for instance, a constituent assembly. Venezuela has a constituent assembly where essentially it was called into being to bring forth people from the working class, just average workers, and just sort of average human beings, with also special seats put aside for indigenous tribes and whatnot, and certain union leaders and whatnot. So like so essentially something like the Constituent Assembly, for that to be kind of the legislative body of Venezuela is an incredibly democratic system to which there's no analog here in the U.S., along with, for instance, the commune system. We don't even know in the U.S. what democracy looks like, because we are actually the ones living, I think, in such a totalitarian police state that we can't even see the forest through the trees here. The escalation essentially from these very heavy sanctions to a full economic embargo, this essentially U.S. foreign policy with any state that it doesn't like, is a policy of stop hitting yourself, where essentially they prevent food and medicine from getting into the country, and then they complain of all the starving citizens within that country. So this full economic embargo, this Cuba-style economic embargo, represents a dangerous new escalation even above and beyond when the Trump administration recently and despicably sanctioned the Venezuelan CLAP program, the food distribution program. What exactly does this mean in real economic terms? Like what sort of separates the sanctions generally from and the blockade generally from this new embargo?
A few things to respond to here. I'll start with Leopoldo Lopez, you mentioned. So anyone who follows Venezuelan politics has probably heard this name. The New York Times trumpeted Leopoldo Lopez as the Martin Luther King of Venezuela, which
Jesus.
is insane. Leopoldo Lopez, as you mentioned, is the far-right leader of the opposition. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about the Venezuelan opposition, it's not one entity. It's extremely fragmented, which is why they have never been able to win, excluding two isolated elections. I mentioned that the PSUV, founded by Hugo Chavez and continued by Nicolas Maduro, the current president, the PSUV has won 23 of the past 25 elections. The reason is because the opposition is extremely divided and because there is no mass movement among the opposition. The PSUV, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, is a major mass movement, and there are also several other large organizations and social movements that strongly support the PSUV, such as the Francisco de Miranda Front, which we never hear about in the U.S., but the FFM, is a major social organization here, a left-wing group named after a contemporary of Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of Latin America, who helped defeat Spanish colonialism. So there are many groups like that. There are also many women's rights groups. And there are many labor unions, which don't get mentioned much, labor unions that are thriving here, that have democratic structures, that have a very active working class, rank and file base, that all strongly support the government. And then, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that there are a lot of religious groups, because like many countries in Latin America, Venezuela is still very religious. There are many Catholics and also increasing numbers of evangelicals. And if you go to any pro-government rally, you will see not just Catholic groups, but you will see, in fact, evangelical groups, especially from this group Ora, which always has flags here. So there's a complex social base behind Chavismo. It goes very, very deep in the roots of Venezuelan society. The opposition has nothing remotely comparable. And the opposition runs the gamut from the kind of centrist, social democratic leaning, but pro-imperialist parties, leaning to the far right of the opposition, like Leopoldo Lopez and his party Voluntad Popular, Popular Will, which is an extreme neoliberal party. You mentioned Juan Guaidó has been trying to push through neoliberal policies. Well, again, to stress this point, Juan Guaidó is from the party of Leopoldo Lopez. Why was Lopez supposedly a so-called political prisoner? He was not a political prisoner, although many billionaire-funded U.S. human rights organizations that support regime change, like Human Rights Watch, called him a prisoner of conscience, which is absurd. Leopoldo Lopez was involved in numerous violent coup attempts on video, handing out supplies to try to overthrow the government, leading people to try to overthrow the democratically elected government. And he was at first arrested and imprisoned, and then as a kind of concession to the opposition, he was put in house arrest. And like you mentioned, during the failed coup attempt, Juan Guaidó took Leopoldo Lopez with the help of soldiers out of house arrest. And where did Lopez go? He went to the Spanish embassy, to the embassy of the former empire that colonized Venezuela 200 years ago and that was liberated by Simón Bolívar, who is the key figure of the Bolivarian Revolution, which is named after him. So the symbolism of that says everything. I don't need to comment further. But you mentioned Juan Guaidó's economic policy. Now, what's funny is Voluntad Popular, the far right wing of the Venezuelan opposition, is technically a member of the so-called Socialist International, which is just a neoliberal organization. As an example, the PRI party in Mexico of Peña Nieto was also, it still is, a member of the so-called Socialist International. This is a thoroughly neoliberal political party. So too is the Israeli Labor Party, which is a right-wing party that actually its own leader said, we are not on the left, we are in the center. This is a right-wing pro-Zionist, pro-apartheid, pro-colonialist party, which is also a member of the so-called Socialist International. So the useful idiots for the right-wing coup attempts who call themselves socialists and try to portray Juan Guaido as somehow left-wing, of which there are several, in the New York Times and other outlets, they have no idea what they're talking about. It is absolutely insane. Voluntad Popular, Juan Guaido and Leopoldo Lopez's party, has been involved in many extreme acts of violence. Also, it is very closely linked to and run by the oligarchs here in Venezuela. Carlos Vecchio, who is the fake U.S.-recognized Venezuelan ambassador of Guaido in the U.S., who has no power and who now controls the embassy because it was illegally taken over. Carlos Vecchio was the lawyer of now ExxonMobil. He was Exxon's man here in Venezuela, and many other of the representatives of the fake coup government of Juan Guaido are representatives from major multinational corporations that have a vested interest in retaking control over Venezuela's economy. That is their economic vision. Voluntad Popular, which was basically created by the U.S. government, by many of these U.S. government-backed soft power groups like the National Endowment for Democracy. Their only vision for Venezuelan society is privatization, is destroying the social programs that have been created by the popular Bolivarian revolution here, ushered in by Hugo Chavez. And another great symbol of it all is that the economic advisor for Juan Guaido, who's leading many of these economic policies, his name is Ricardo Hausman, is a neoliberal right-wing Harvard economist who was the mastermind of the neoliberal IMF-backed economic policies here in Venezuela in the 1980s, which destroyed the Venezuelan economy and led to what is known here as the Caracaso in 1989, which was a massive uprising against the neoliberal government and the policies that were immiserating the population, and the so-called democratic government, the neoliberal regime, responded to the Caracaso uprising by massacring hundreds and perhaps thousands of the protesters who were protesting against the IMF-backed austerity. So this is the crew that the U.S. government and its puppet opposition has gathered to try to overthrow the elected government here and install a right-wing, plutocratic, neoliberal regime. And they have utterly failed. One other final point about Juan Guaido. This scandal got almost no mainstream media coverage in the U.S., but it was all over the media here, and Venezuelans are furious. During the coup attempt, the first of several coup attempts on February 23rd, where you had the billionaire owner of the company Virgin, organizing a fake humanitarian aid concert to supposedly raise money for humanitarian aid for Venezuelans. You also had fake aid coming in from USAID, an arm of U.S. regime change and soft power, where they tried to forcibly push through a fake aid convoy on a bridge connecting Colombia and Venezuela in an area of Colombia called Cucuta. Now, there was a lot of discussion of that in the media. What there wasn't discussion of is that this fake aid money that was raised to supposedly help Venezuelans who are not actually suffering from a humanitarian crisis, that money was wasted by Juan Guaido and his gang of neoliberal criminals. They took that money and spent hundreds of thousands of US dollars in a poor city in Colombia, where hundreds of thousands of US dollars is effectively equal to millions of dollars in the US. They used this money and spent it on partying and drugs and alcohol and women. I mean, these are the disgusting people that the U.S. empire has chosen to try to overthrow Venezuela. Not only are they right-wing neoliberals, but they're thoroughly corrupt, and they use aid money, supposed aid money, to party and live it up. These are the people that the U.S. has chosen to try to install. So the other points you mentioned, we can definitely go through, but we need to understand that these are the actors who are behind the coup attempt.
Yeah, for those of you who are just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin, and it's also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We're talking with Ben Norton of The Grayzone. In the corporate media, you would think Venezuela was absolutely the worst, most repressive state that's ever existed. Venezuela as a state is so truly democratic. The PSUV truly brings in a level of kind of democratic participation of the vast majority of the people in ways that the previous government, the neoliberal government that machine gunned hundreds or thousands of its own citizens in the Caracas could never even imagine, and kind of democratic institutions that we ourselves could never even imagine. But at the same time, we have truly actual repressive regimes that are put in place in places like Honduras. And you could almost say that Honduras, in certain ways, is sort of the model for what the U.S. would want in Venezuela. If the U.S. were to get its way in overthrowing the Venezuelan government, it would look something like Honduras, or probably Colombia as well. You've also spent some time in Honduras, so if you can maybe give us kind of the rundown of the situation there with regard to repression of protests and whatnot.
The only repression I've witnessed here in Venezuela is this ridiculously loud vacuum of my neighbor in this apartment. But I apologize for that. But you can see that clearly Venezuelans are suffering and being forced to vacuum their apartment for 4 hours a day. But yeah, it's very important that this key parallel between what's actually happening in Honduras and what's happening here in Venezuela is so important. A lot of people in the U.S. have never even heard of Honduras, or if they have, of course, they only know about the refugees fleeing the country. Now, why are so many refugees fleeing Honduras? I wonder why. It is almost entirely because of policies of the U.S. government. Specifically, in 2009, Honduras had a very progressive-oriented, democratically elected government. It was not a socialist government. The government never called itself socialist like the governing party here in Venezuela. It was a progressive-oriented nationalist party. And the president was too left-wing for the U.S. And keep in mind, this is when the Barack Obama administration was in power. And the Obama administration, under the tutelage of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, overthrew the democratically elected progressive government of Honduras and installed a right-wing military dictatorship. Now, this May 2019, I and my colleagues Max Blumenthal and Anya Parampil from The Grayzone traveled to Honduras to report on the 10th anniversary of this U.S.-backed military coup, which has completely destabilized and devastated the country, which now has the largest refugee crisis in Latin America. And we can talk about its neighbors. This is not something in Central America that every country is suffering from. In fact, the more closely allied a country is in Latin America to the U.S., the more they suffer from this problem. And the more they are seen as a so-called enemy, like Nicaragua and Cuba. These are the countries that don't have refugee crises. In Central America, Honduras has the worst refugee crisis, and the country with the fewest refugees fleeing is Nicaragua, which the neoconservative National Security Advisor John Bolton just identified as part of the so-called troika of tyranny. So that says everything as well. But what's happening now in Honduras is that the government is still effectively a puppet regime controlled by the U.S. I spent nearly 4 weeks in Honduras traveling not just in the capital Tegucigalpa, but to other areas. And people from all walks of life all say that they're just a U.S. colony and they don't really have any control. Honduras is the site of the largest U.S. military base in all of Latin America, which is an extremely strategic U.S. military base called Sotocano or Palmarola Air Base. And in addition to that, of course, people might have heard of the famous human rights activist Berta Cáceres, who was a women's rights activist and environmentalist from an indigenous movement called COPIN in Honduras. She was murdered by a paramilitary group that was trained by the Honduran state forces that were in turn trained by the U.S. government. So the U.S. has its hands all over this. And those forces were hired by a company called DESA, which is an energy company that is destroying indigenous areas and communities inside Honduras to develop the privatized electrical sector on behalf of the Honduran elite. And Max Blumenthal, Anya Parmpo, and I traveled to 2 different rural villages in Honduras, one called Retoca and the other called La Esperanza. La Esperanza is the community where Berta Cáceres was born and raised. We visited the home of Berta and we interviewed her mother, and we also interviewed her daughters, one of whom is now a representative from the leftist Libre Party of the overthrown president. So the resistance is very strong. The resistance is growing despite the extreme oppression. We also visited this community, Retoca, which is a small indigenous village, and we drove like 3 hours on unpaved roads, and our car got caught, and we visited this small village where the community is going to be destroyed, completely displaced, because an international, partially Italian-owned multinational corporation is going to displace the indigenous community and turn the river that they all rely on for their water to drink, to cook, to bathe in, to clean their clothes. This is going to be destroyed and turned into a electric plant for this international corporation. So again, we see that this right-wing dictatorship that steals elections, that stole the 2017 election, that rigged the 2013 election, that is implementing extreme right-wing neoliberal policies, is back to the hilt, still by Washington. And then the final cherry on top, as if you just can't imagine as if things can get worse, is that the regime in Honduras of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who goes by Ho, he's known by most people as J-O-H, Ho. And you always, everywhere you go, you hear people say, fuera Ho, fuera Ho. And not even in political places. For instance, we were at some bars, some middle-class bars in the capital, Tegucigalpa, and randomly people will just start chanting, fuera Ho, fuera Ho. That's how unpopular this regime is, that even middle-class people who are not necessarily sympathetic to the left are so fed up with this corrupt puppet regime. And the cherry on top is that this past month, a U.S. federal court in New York named Juan Orlando Hernandez, the U.S.-backed puppet leader, as a co-conspirator in a drug trafficking case. He himself, according to this U.S. court, not a foreign court, a U.S. court, admitted that he himself is involved in trafficking drugs, and specifically used drug money from illegal drugs to fund his campaign in the rigged 2013 election. So we have a U.S.-backed puppet leader whose military police are shooting protesters in the street who are protesting his privatization measures and killing activists. When we were there were student protests against the privatization measures he's trying to implement to privatize health and education. And the military police entered illegally the Autonomous University of Honduras, which, as its name suggests, is autonomous. It's independent. The state cannot send its own police military in, and they did it anyway. And they shot student protesters, peaceful student protesters, with live ammunition to try to break up the student occupation that has taken over the university. And that happened multiple times when I was there in the country. There's extreme violence in the streets. And meanwhile, the actual drug trafficking dictator, whose brother Tony Hernandez put his initials on his bags of cocaine and is now in jail. These are the crooks that the U.S. is backing in Honduras. And everything that the U.S. empire claims, all the lies it claims about Venezuela, are just projection for what its own crooked criminal allies are doing, its own puppets are doing here in the region. Venezuela does not have 1/10 of the problems that the tiny country of Honduras is suffering from, and the people are suffering from. And it is this corruption and this violence and this dictatorship that has fueled the largest refugee crisis in Latin America, which is coming from Honduras.
Yeah, so much of that is truly a crucial context to understand the kind of double speak, the kind of through the looking glass element of U.S. Corporate media. I think it's just the key point I want to hone in on especially is that projection element, because I think that's so important to realize that most of what we hear about any given country that's resisting U.S. empire in any way whatsoever, usually what gets said about that country is entirely projection based on usually on things that are going on in the countries that the U.S. is backing. So, for instance, the Trump administration has ludicrously, and I think some corporate media has also said this, has ludicrously accused Venezuela of being like this major narco state exporting cocaine, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody actually believes this, but this is simply the excuse to make these sanctions look somehow justified, that we have to prevent cocaine from getting smuggled through the CLAP program or whatnot. And again, like, most Americans don't even know what the CLAP program is. They don't understand that. But a quick
point on this, because this is so crucial. We were talking about Honduras, which is a tiny country in Central America. Let's talk about the key U.S. ally in the region, which just so happens to be a neighbor of Venezuela. It's called Colombia, which is, as every single person on the planet knows, the leading country in the international drug trade, specifically in the cocaine trade. We're supposed to believe that Venezuela is supposedly smuggling and trafficking drugs. Meanwhile, the closest U.S. ally in the region for decades is the leading global trafficker of drugs. The Colombian government and the paramilitary groups supported by, and in some cases created by, the Colombian state, which have been funded with millions of dollars through the U.S. government's Plan Colombia. This is the most extreme hypocrisy you can imagine. I mean, it's like being Jeffrey Dahmer or supporting Jeffrey Dahmer and then being like, this person, they are mean to their friends and they assaulted me. And it's like, no, you're supporting the most ferociously violent drug traffickers in the entire region, and then trying to accuse Venezuela of the exact crimes that you are not only supporting now, but have been supporting for decades.
I'm wondering if we can also pivot a little bit to Nicaragua, and I'm wondering if we can just get a little bit of a kind of your expertise, because you've also spent time on the ground in Nicaragua for the anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. What exactly, I guess, is the general sort of a political situation there? Because the Sandinistas also faced a similar, essentially kind of a color revolution style, violent uprising. I think it was 2017, 2018.
Absolutely. So last year, there was a blatant coup attempt in Nicaragua against the progressive, once again, democratically elected government of the president Daniel Ortega. which is led by the Sandinista Front for National Liberation, the Frente Sandinista, which led in the 1970s and throughout the 80s, led the struggle first against a U.S.-backed dictatorship and then against U.S.-backed right-wing death squads and terrorists who, surprise, surprise, were also implicated in the drug trade. Now, Nicaragua is very much a democracy. It is much more democratic than U.S. allies like Honduras and Colombia. But, of course, the U.S. claims that Nicaragua is a dictatorship, which is absurd. And, as I mentioned, the neoconservative national security advisor in the Trump administration pushing a lot of these policies, John Bolton, an architect of the Iraq War, has identified Nicaragua as part of the so-called troika of tyranny, along with Venezuela and Cuba, which happen to be some of the only remaining progressive governments in the region. It's not a coincidence, of course, with independent governments and independent foreign policy. John Bolton, I should remind listeners, also has repeatedly invoked the 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine. He has actually said in a quote, I'm quoting him, "We are not afraid of using the word Monroe Doctrine," which is actually two words, not one, but that doesn't stop him. And again, this is an 1830s era, explicitly colonial era doctrine where the U.S. empire said, we control Latin America, it's our backyard. The Trump administration has brought that back. Now, the Obama administration was carrying out similar policies, as you mentioned, but at least it was smart enough to know not to invoke 200-year colonial doctrines when it's carrying out neocolonial policy. The Trump administration has removed the mask and is blatantly neocolonial in this way. Nicaragua is another country that suffered from this coup attempt, an extremely violent coup attempt last year in which hundreds of people were killed. Of course, the corporate media and the U.S. government and fake human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International only talk about the people who were killed or wounded by the security forces in Nicaragua. And it's, of course, incredibly tragic that anyone died. Of course, what they don't mention is the equal and actually greater number of people killed, tortured, wounded, shot, attacked, assaulted by the U.S.-backed right-wing opposition inside Nicaragua, which was carrying out an eliminationist policy targeting Sandinista activists, in one case burning down the home of Sandinista activists, killing several members of the family in a well-known neighborhood that's called Barrio Carlos Marx, named after Karl Marx, of course. And you know, it's pretty clear when right-wing U.S.-backed insurgents are burning down the homes of Sandinistas in a neighborhood called Carlos Marx, this is obviously not some kind of progressive democratic revolution, although if you listen to some people in DSA and Jacobin magazine, you would think otherwise. And we were there, Max was in Nicaragua last year during the end of the failed coup attempt. I was there this year, and we were there in July during the 40th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution, which again overthrew a U.S.-backed dictatorship. And we can say very conclusively, you can see our reports at The Grayzone, that is thegrayzone.com with an A, the American spelling of gray. You can see that the revolution is alive and well, the Sandinista Revolution is so much more than just the president, Daniel Ortega, who's all we ever hear about. There is a massive social infrastructure behind the Sandinista Revolution. The FSLN, the Sandinista Front, is a very active party with a major youth wing that has lots of organizations. There's a major left-wing grassroots media apparatus of different groups. There are women's rights groups. There are LGBT groups. I mean, compared to many parts of Latin America, which are still very conservative culturally, Nicaragua is conservative socially. Abortion is illegal. LGBT rights are limited. But compared to the region, they're much more advanced, and they're moving forward on these issues, on these key contradictions. And Nicaragua is also, like I mentioned, the most peaceful country in Central America. There are very few people leaving Nicaragua. The economy, we hear all these Republicans and neoliberals talk about, oh, I support small businesses. Well, the strategy of the Sandinistas is to encourage domestic production inside Nicaragua, and they do that through supporting small businesses. And in fact, it's very much not a socialist economy. It is a social democratic government that provides many strong social support systems and provides healthcare for free, education at all levels for free, women's needs in terms of there are lots of programs provided for pregnant women. There are lots of programs provided for maternity leave and for young children. I mean, these are all very strongly funded advanced social programs that don't exist in much of Latin America that are supported by the state. And I'll say finally that when I was there with Max Blumenthal, my colleague, he actually got really sick and really nauseous, and he passed out and cut his head open and was bleeding everywhere. So we had to take him. And at the time, we were in a small rural area. We were not in the capital, Managua. We were in a small rural village called San Juan del Sur. And despite the fact that it's a very small town, we took him to the ER, the emergency room, and immediately he was seen without any wait, and he didn't pay a single cent. They gave him stitches and some medicine, and then he was on his way. It took 20 minutes. There was no waiting, and he didn't pay a single cent. If this happened in the U.S., my experience with ERs, it would have cost thousands of dollars, and we would have had to wait hours. So everything that they say about Nicaragua in the corporate media is such a ridiculous lie. It is one of the most democratic countries in the region. It is very much not a dictatorship. It has a mixed economy with capitalists who still have control over large parts of the economy. And it has a democratically elected government that was elected in 2007 and has been repeatedly elected since then.
Having seen Honduras, for instance, where this U.S.-backed puppet regime is kind of in this state of brutal repression, having spent significant time both in Nicaragua and Venezuela, and having done this much kind of research on the different kind of political factions within those, what do you generally see as sort of the possible realignment, especially given that Colombia is continuing in its tradition of a kind of military dictatorship with Ivan Duque, and of course Brazil. We just saw the rise to power of Bolsonaro a few years back, but it seems like Bolsonaro is also facing a lot of general resistance and may not be able to, complete this the kind of fascistic project that he wants to. With that remains to be seen. But I would say generally, like, how do you see kind of the realignment of kind of progressive politics with the remaining pink tide countries that kind of are holding on after essentially the Venezuelan revolution, the Bolivarian revolution? How do you see the kind of realignment? And do you think that as the sort of thesis goes with your interview with Daniel Ortega, where it's the title is "We Must Develop a Multipolar World," how do you see that multipolarity actually kind of playing out? Are these countries in the long term, do you think, going to be able to kind of defend themselves against the what I argue is kind of the U.S. empire going supernova in some regard?
That's a good way of putting it. No, I mean, we see the result of the unipolar world that is breaking down, where the U.S. empire is trying to suffocate and destroy every independent government in the world through collective punishment, barbaric siege warfare, medieval-style siege warfare against the entire civilian populations of not just Venezuela, of also Iran, which is suffering under similar sanctions, of Cuba, of Nicaragua, even brutal sanctions against Russia. The Trump administration has advanced the Obama administration's policy of sanctions to a whole new staggering level, exponentially, just going wild and just telling the entire world that tough luck, we control you, and if you want to try to oppose us, we're going to destroy your economy. And of course, what that is accelerating the decline of the U.S. empire at the same time, which is why I like the supernova analogy. And it's also accelerating the decline of the U.S. dollar, which is the key weapon, not just the U.S. military, but also the U.S. dollar. Of course, it's the U.S. military machine that keeps the U.S. dollar as the international currency reserve, the de facto currency reserve of the entire world, but reserve currency of the entire world. But at the same time, now Venezuela, for instance, it has been trying to move away because, let's be clear, the embargo is so criminal, but it's not new. The Trump administration has been expanding sanctions that began once again under Obama. In 2015, Obama absurdly, ridiculously declared Venezuela to be a so-called national security threat. Now, to whom? Of course, they never described that, but it was part of the strategy where the Obama administration was opening diplomatic doors with Cuba and slightly easing but not ending the blockade, while at the same time tightening a blockade on Venezuela. And that 2015 executive order of the so-called national security threat of Venezuela justified imposing sanctions on the Venezuelan government leadership, which then were grossly expanded by Trump into a de facto blockade in mid-2017, and that de facto blockade has become an official embargo now. So in 2017, in mid-2017, the Trump administration sanctioned the oil sector and then expanded sanctions further, making it illegal for U.S. companies to work with the Venezuelan government. Now, because of the embargo, any company in the world cannot do business with Venezuela's internationally recognized democratically elected government, which sits at the United Nations still. Any company in the world that does business with Venezuela faces secondary sanctions from the U.S., which is effectively a declaration of economic war on the planet, similar to the economic war on Iran. Both of these forms of blockade of Iran and Venezuela are preventing these countries from importing not just food, which we talked about, but also importing medicine, medical equipment, machine parts. So, for instance, here in Venezuela, according to two world-renowned economists, Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot, in less than 2 years, in 2017 and 2018, the U.S. sanctions led to the excess preventable deaths of 40,000 Venezuelan civilians. That is a conservative estimate. And these Venezuelans died largely because they couldn't get medicine, they couldn't get medical care, they couldn't get machine parts needed to fix things here that Venezuela can't import, which has prevented things like the cable car, the famous cable car in Caracas, from being able to run. It's prevented hospitals from having certain machines. This is collective punishment. It is siege warfare on the entire civilian population. These should be recognized as crimes against humanity, similar to the crime against humanity carried out against the Iraqi civilian population in the 1990s, which led to the mass death of hundreds of thousands of children, which famously were infamously defended by the U.S. Secretary of State, who also was the U.S. representative of the UN, Madeleine Albright, under Bill Clinton, who famously on 60 Minutes said, yes, we think the price is worth it. The price of killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. This policy is not new. It is a genocidal policy of imperialism, which is now in overdrive under the Trump administration. And to finally answer your question, can and will it change? The answer is it has to change, and it is slowly changing. In Venezuela here, in July, we saw a very important meeting that got a total blackout in the corporate media of the non-aligned movement, where 120 countries from around the world, representing 2/3 of the world's population, met here in Caracas and came to several agreements, including the agreement in support of Venezuela's only legitimate government of the elected president Nicolas Maduro, which 2/3 of the global population now, their governments recognize as the only president of Venezuela. The 120 countries, they also called for an end to U.S. sanctions, the suffocating economic warfare on Venezuela, along with sanctions against Iran and other countries. So yes, there is a massive movement of resistance representing the global majority. It's only a small minority of the dictatorship of capitalists in the US and Europe, and even Europe is increasingly frustrated, that supports this policy of international global dictatorship of empire. They talk about dictatorship in other countries, in Russia and China. They are the ones who are supporting the dictatorship of the US dollar and US empire that can suffocate the entire civilian population of any country that is not sufficiently going to bow down and kowtow to Washington. And that's breaking apart slowly, but increasingly. And I will say, you mentioned that the pink tide governments, the progressive governments in the region, many of which have been overthrown in coups or soft coups by the US. You mentioned Brazil. Right now, the most popular president in Brazilian history, Lula da Silva, he should be seen as the only real legitimate president of Brazil because he's now a political prisoner. He would have handily, by 20%, won the most recent election, but he was barred from the election. Why was he barred? He was imprisoned under fake accusations of corruption, which we now know were carried out by the judge Sergio Moro in collaboration with the U.S. government. And we have leaked documents, thanks to Glenn Greenwald, showing that Sergio Moro was conspiring with the right wing and with the U.S. government to make fake charges to have a soft coup against the progressive, not socialist, the progressive elected government of Dilma Rousseff, of the Workers' Party of Brazil, that, like I said, was not socialist, but also wanted its own independent path in support for the Brazilian people. And the U.S. wanted a puppet dictatorship, which is what it has now. The U.S. helped install a fascist regime under Jair Bolsonaro, which, by the way, was also caught smuggling 40 kilograms of cocaine on his personal plane. So you have another corrupt, far-right narco dictatorship in Brazil that is carrying out massive crimes against its own population. Meanwhile, Lula da Silva, the most popular president in Brazilian history, from the poor working class of Brazil, a union organizer, is now suffering in prison as a political prisoner. But there is hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel, not just with Venezuela, which survived the coup attempt, not just with Bolivia, which has a progressive democratically elected government, not just with Cuba, which continues to survive, but also now there's a lot of hope from people in Argentina, which just had a primary election in which the vice president, who is a very important, it's not just the vice president, but she's working with a president from a progressive-oriented kind of social democratic background. And the Kirchners might come back in Argentina. And again, they're not socialists, but they're progressive-oriented folks who were part of the pink tide, who want an independent foreign policy for their region and don't want to be puppet states of the U.S. So there is hope here in Caracas. People are hopeful. They just had the international meeting of the Foro de Sao Paulo, in which there were international agreements made with the forces of the left in the region. So there is a move swinging back toward the left. The struggle is going to be very difficult, not just here in Latin America, but around the world, because the dictatorship of empire and capitalism has hardened further and further and become more repressive as the U.S. and Europe move further to the right. But once again, Latin America and large parts of the global south continue to be a beacon of hope for real democracy and for real progressive change in the world.
I think that's a great place to leave it. We're going to wrap up there. We've been joined by Ben Norton, an editor with The Grayzone, as well as the producer of Moderate Rebels podcast, which he co-hosts with Max Blumenthal. Thank you very much, Ben, for coming on the show once again, joining us from Caracas.
It's always my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.